Zetetic Cosmogony by Thomas Winship, continued. Starting with Section 6, Circumnavigation. Circumnavigation is said to be one of the best proofs that the Earth is a globe. It is often asserted, generally by those who have not the remotest idea of the subject, that ships have sailed round the world on one course, east or west, and come back to the place where they started from. It will be a surprise to such to be informed that this wonderful feat of navigation has never yet been accomplished, and that it is most unlikely that it will ever come to be a fact, and that it would take several of the proverbial small fortunes to successfully carry it out. Some people think it is quite an easy matter to start from, say, Liverpool, and steer west and come back to the starting point. Suppose we attempt such a journey. After crossing the Atlantic, we must leave the ship and traverse the American continent. As there are no roads running due west, we should have to take the sun's bearing almost hourly to keep us on the true course, sometimes having to cross private property, travel through cultivated lands, and in some cases to go through other people's houses to preserve a westerly course. Suppose we arrived at the other side and then took a ship across the Pacific. We should again have to travel across a continent, thousands of miles, to get back to the North Sea, and then across it and England we might arrive at Liverpool. If anyone thinks this possible, he ought to try it. If the reader will scan the surface of a school globe, he will at once see that if such a thing should ever be attempted, no reasonable hope of success could ever be entertained unless the attempt were made in the extreme south, or in an airplane, but this book was written prior to the airplane, so anyway. Suppose a ship to start from Cape Point, latitude 34 south, and steer east. The first land encountered would be Australia. She would then have to go south to clear the land, and so could not return to her starting point on an easterly course, but would have to take many courses to return there. Let the ship start from Cape Horn in latitude 56 south and steer west. She would soon encounter islands and would have to alter her course to north or south to clear them, and so could not get back to Cape Horn on a westerly course. The same would apply on an easterly course. It is evident, therefore, that the earth can only be circumnavigated on one course in the extreme south. There, the dangers of icebergs, of magnitudes never met with in the north, and darkness during a great part of the year, would render such an expedition costly, dangerous, and of long duration. Say a vessel starts on an easterly or westerly course in latitude 65 south. She could only sail during the very finest of summer weather, and would have to come north during the winter. Returning to her last point, she could again start on the course round the world, and continue so long as the fine weather lasted, repeating the process of going north during the dark and winter months. That this would occupy a long time and cost a deal of money is plain enough to anyone willing to be convinced. For these reasons, I am of the opinion that no ship will ever sail round the world on one course and come back to her starting point, and yet some the world a globe. One of the greatest feats of navigation will tell you that it has been done scores of times, and proves the world to be a globe. Of course, this seamanship that man could undertake, and which has never yet been attempted, is spoken of as though it were a matter of almost daily occurrence. And who but the astronomers are responsible for such like fallacies in school books and astronomical works? Who but those famed for learned ignorance are answerable for the foolish arrogance and the stupid credulity of the masses on this subject? Can there be any truth in a science which is founded upon conjecture and supported by so-called facts as proof of its correctness, which facts have never existed outside the brains of their inventors? If it were said that a vessel could sail around the world, allowing for deviations for land, ice, and other obstacles in the way of her making one course, so that by making many and various courses she could at length return to her starting point, I would have no quarrel with the propounders of circumnavigation. But if the general statement on the point were reduced and brought within the compass of fact, in language such as the above, the supposed proof of the world's rotundity would be annihilated. In Ever's book Navigation, it is stated that a vessel may leave a port, sail round the Earth, and come back to her starting point on one course. This, I have no hesitation in stating, is absolutely false. If otherwise, I should be glad to be informed of the name of the port. The learned are beginning to see through the fallacy of the circumnavigation proof of the world's rotundity, as the following from, quote, Elementary Physiography by Professor Richard A. Gregory, FRAS, clearly shows, quote, the earth has been circumnavigated a great many times, and it is a common occurrence for a ship to leave England, and by steering westward all the voyage to arrive in England again, without retracing an inch of her way. Similarly, we can journey round the globe, sometimes traveling on land, and sometimes on the sea, but eventually returning to the starting point without at all turning back on our course. This would appear to be a certain proof that the earth's surface is curved. Nevertheless, it has been pointed out that circumnavigation would be possible if the earth had a flat surface, with the north magnetic pole at its center. A compass needle would then always point to the center of the surface, and so a ship might sail due east and west, as indicated by the compass, and eventually return to the same point by describing a circle upon the plane." End quote. D. Wilson Barker, RNR FRSE, remarks in his work on navigation, quote, "The fact that the earth has been sailed round is not sufficient proof as to its exact shape." End quote. After these so-called authoritative statements, we may hope that this so-called proof of the globular shape of the earth will soon be expunged from the textbooks. Curvature. In Chambers' mathematical tables, the curvature of the globe is given as 7.935 inches to the mile, varying inversely as the square of the distance. If it be required to ascertain the curvature on a globe of 25,000 statute miles, equatorial circumference, square the distance and multiply by 7.935 inches. The result is the curvature. Thus, in 6 miles there is a dip of nearly 24 feet. In 30 miles, nearly 600 feet, and so on. In Mensuration by T. Baker, C.E., the correction for curvature is said to be 7.962 inches to the mile. These two equations so nearly agree and amount to just about what the correction would be on a globe of the size of the earth is said to be, that they may be taken as correct. If, therefore, the world we live on is a globe, it is a simple matter to find out how far any object at a given height can be seen. In September 1898, this author received a letter from Australia in which the writer says, quote, "In the year 1872 I was aboard a ship, Thomas Wood, Captain Gibson, from China to London. Owing to making a long passage, we ran short of provisions, and so short after rounding the Cape that the captain spoke of putting into St. Helena for a supply. It was then my hobby to get the first glimpse of land, and in order to do this I would go up to the top-gallant yard and make a survey just as the sun would be rising. The island was clearly in view, well on the starboard bow. I reported this to Captain Gibson. He disbelieved me, saying it was impossible, as we were 75 miles distant. He, however, offered me paper and pencil to sketch the land that I saw, and this I did. He then said, 'You are right,' and shaped his course accordingly. I have never seen the island before, and could not have described the shape of it had I not seen it." End quote. St. Helena is a high volcanic island, and if my informant had seen the top only, there would have been an allowance made for the height of the land, but as he sketched the island, he must have seen the whole of it, which should have been 3,650 feet below the line of sight, if the world be a globe, deducting 100 feet for the height of the yard he viewed it from. In Chambers' Information for the People, section on Physical Geometry, Geography, page 59, the following occurs, quote, "In North America, the basin or drainage of the Mississippi is estimated at 1.3 million square miles, and that of the St. Laurent at 600,000, while northward of the 50th parallel extends an inhospitable flat of perhaps greater dimensions. Next, in order of importance, is that section of Europe extending from the German Sea through Prussia, Poland, and Russia towards the Ural Mountains, presenting indifferently tracts of heath, sand, and open pasture, and regarded by geographers as one vast plain. So flat is the general profile of the region that it has been remarked, it is impossible to draw a line from London to Moscow which would not perceptibly vary from a dead level. End quote. The foregoing is a London to Moscow proof that the surface of the world is not globular. On a globe, no matter how powerful the grass, only a certain distance could be seen, as the roundness of the globe would prevent a glass from seeing around it. How powerful the glass, only a certain distance could be seen, as the roundness of the globe would prevent a glass from seeing around it, and its thickness would equally prevent one seeing through it. But in fine weather, objects at distances out of all proportion to what the curvature would allow are visible with the assistance of a good telescope. The following from the Voyage of a Naturalist by C. Darwin, page 166, illustrates this point. Quote, "The guanaco, or wild llama. Mr. Stokes told me that he one day saw, through a glass, a herd of these animals which evidently had been frightened, and were running away at full speed, although their distance was so great that he could not distinguish them with the naked eye." End quote. From the Atlas of Physical Geography by Rev. T. Milner, M.A., I extract the following. Quote, "Vast areas exhibit a perfectly dead level, scarcely a rise existing through 1,500 miles from the Carpathians to the Urals. South of the Baltic, the contrary is so flat that a prevailing north wind will drive the waters of the Statner half into the mouth of the Oder and give the river a backward flow for 30 or 40 miles. The plains of Venezuela and New Granada in South America, chiefly on the left of the Orinoco, are termed llanos, or level fields. Often in the space of 270 square miles, the surface does not vary a single foot. The Amazon only falls 12 feet in the last 700 miles of its course. La Plata has only a descent of 1/33 of an inch per mile." End quote. These extracts clearly prove that the surface of the earth is a level surface, and that, therefore, the world is not a globe. And when we come to consider the surface of the world under the sea, we shall find the same uniformity of evidence against the popular view. In Nature and Man, by Professor W. B. Carpenter, article called "The Deep Sea and Its Contents," pages 320 and 321, the writer says, quote, "Nothing seems to have struck the Challenger surveyors more than the extraordinary flatness, except in the neighborhood of land, of that depressed portion of the earth's crust which forms the floor of the great oceanic area. If the bottom of mid-ocean were laid dry, an observer standing on any spot of it would find himself surrounded by a plain, only comparable to that of the North American prairies or the South American pampas. The form of the depressed area which lodges the water of the deep ocean is rather, indeed, to be likened to that of the flat water, or tea tray, surrounded by an elevated and deeply sloping rim, than to that of the basin with which it is commonly compared." End quote. This remarkable writer tells us of thousands of miles in the Atlantic, the Pacific, and the great southern ocean beds being a planar surface, and from his remarks it is clear that a flat surface is the general contour of the bed of the great oceans for tens of thousands of square miles. Canals. If the earth be the globe of popular belief, it is very evident that in cutting a canal, an allowance must be made for the curvature of the globe, which allowance would be correspondent to the square of the distance multiplied by 8 inches, nearly. From the Age of 5th August, 1893, I extract the following. Quote, "The German Emperor performed the ceremony of opening the gates of the Baltic and North Sea Canal in the spring of 1891. The canal starts at Haltenau and on the south side of Clell Bay and joins the Elbe 15 miles above its mouth. It is 61 miles long, 200 feet wide at the surface, and 85 feet at the bottom, the depth being 28 feet. No locks are required as the surface of the two seas is level." End quote. Let those who believe it is the practice for surveyors to make allowance for curvature ponder over the following from the Manchester Ship Canal Company, Earth Review, October of 1893. Quote, "It is customary in railway and canal constructions for all levels to be referred to a datum which is nominally horizontal and is so shown on all sections. It is not the practice in laying out public works to make any allowance for the curvature of the earth." End quote. Manchester Ship Canal Company, Engineer's Office, 19th February 1892. A surveyor, Mr. T. Westwood, writes to the Earth Review for January 1896 as follows, quote, "In leveling I work from ordnance marks or canal levels to get the height above sea level. I work sometimes from what is known as the Wolverhampton level. This is said to be 473.19 feet above sea level. Sometimes I work from the Birmingham level. This is said to be 453.04 feet above sea level. Sometimes I work from the Walsall level, said to be 407.89 feet above sea level. The puzzle to me used to be that, though each extends several miles, each level was and is treated throughout its whole length as the same level from end to end, not the least allowance being made for curvature, although if the earth were a globe, 112 feet ought to be allowed. One of the civil engineers in this district, after some amount of argument on each side as to the reason why no allowance for curvature was made, said he did not believe anybody would know the shape of the earth in this lifetime." End quote. I think most will grant that a practical man is capable of forming a judgment, in all cases of more value than the merely theoretical calculator. Here, then, we have the evidence of practical men to the effect that no allowance for curvature is made in cutting canals, a clear proof that we are not living on a huge ball, but on a surface, the general contour of which is level, as the datum line from which surveys are made is always a horizontal line. Disappearances of ships at sea. J. W. Draper, in his Conflict Between Religion and Science, page 160, says, "The circular visible horizon and its dip at sea, the gradual appearance and disappearance of ships in the offing, cannot fail to incline intelligent sailors to a belief in the globular form of the earth." End quote. The quote-unquote circular visible horizon amounts to nothing, because if we take our stand in a large square of, say, 20 miles, the visible horizon will be circular, any point in the distance being the edge of the circular vision. If we measured off a square of 100 miles or so, the vision would be bounded by a circle, the limit of sight. So the circular visible horizon may at once be dismissed, but its dip at sea is just what has never been seen. It is the very thing that requires to be seen to establish the globular theory. It is the very thing that never has been seen. Wherever we look at sea, the water extends in one straight line, as far as the eye can reach. A flat surface is always seen, and the ships are seen at distances altogether out of proportion to the allowance to be made for convexity, if the surface were in fact a convex one. When a ship or any other object recedes from the observer on a level surface, the highest part is always seen last by reason of perspective, so that the masts and sails of a receding vessel on a flat surface should be seen long after the hull has become invisible to the naked eye. Besides this law of perspective, the hull of a vessel is generally of a dark color, and often at a very short distance disappears to the naked eye, because it has lost its individuality in the mass of surrounding water, both hull and water being nearly of the same color. It appears to have mingled with the water, and thus is lost to our sight. The hull has no background whatever, but the masts and sails have a splendid background against the sky, and stand out to advantage, and are, for this reason also, seen long after the hull has vanished. But that hull has not gone down behind a hill of water, that it is not because of the globular surface of the water that it is invisible, has been proved by the writer many times. At Cape Town, some time ago, this author made special experiments with a view to arrive at the truth of the matter. On one occasion, he watched the schooner Lilla of Cape Town sail away north, bound to Saldanha Bay. Instead of gradually going down the hill of water, the observer always being on the highest part, she appeared to ascend an inclined plane until she reached the level of my eye, perhaps 100 feet above sea level, and then gradually diminished in size. Soon her hull disappeared, and it was painted black, and her masts and sails became smaller and smaller every minute. Then I applied a binocular to the eye and saw her hull plainly enough. It remained in sight until the individuality of the vessel's parts were lost in the distance yet again. The iron barque La Croada of Liverpool sailed out of Table Bay bound to Australia. I watched her until the hull had completely disappeared, but on applying the glass I saw it as clearly as possible, and this when the vessel was at least 10 miles away, so that the hill of water in both of these instances was only imaginary. In May of 1895 I was a passenger on board the USS Goth. In Algoa Bay I gave a brief lecture on the subject of this work, and had much discussion with some of the passengers, one affirming he could believe all I said, with the exception of the way I accounted for the disappearance of ships at sea. I replied that we would likely see one of the ships, and then it could be tested. Next day I observed a vessel about 10 miles away, but though the masts and sails were pretty clear, the hull was not to be seen. Applying the glass, I saw the hull as plain as any other part of the ship. I called the gentleman with whom I had had the previous day's conversation and showed him the vessel. I asked him to look at the ship for some time so as to be quite sure whether the hull was visible or not. After looking a minute or so, he was quite certain that the hull could not be seen. I asked him why it was invisible. "Well, because," he said, "it is hidden behind a hill of water, the surface of the ocean being convex." I asked him if he believed my glass could see through a so-called hill of water, and gave him the astronomer's curvature for the distance, which he admitted to be 10 miles, as 10 by 10 by 8 inches equals 66 feet, less 20 feet for height of the eye, and 10 feet for height of the other vessel's hull, equals 36 feet at the hull should have been below water. He replied that the glass could not, of course, see through a hill of water, and applied it to his eye. Great was his astonishment on seeing the hull, but equally ready was his confession that the theory of the earth's rotundity, founded on the disappearance of ships at sea, was necessarily false. On a steamer in March of 1897, when near St. Helena, my attention was called to a large vessel, just before sunset. With the naked eye, the masts and sails were visible enough, but nothing on the hull could be seen. On applying the glass, there appeared to be no difference, and I was for some time lost in wonder. But as the sun got lower in the heavens, I noticed that the vessel's hull was overshadowed by banks of black clouds low down on the water, and thus could not be seen. The hull was enveloped in a dense blackness, and was lost to the eye. But as soon as the sun was low enough to counteract this effect, I saw the hull quite plainly with the glass, when only the sails were visible to the naked eye before. Between Tenerife and Southampton we sighted a large four-masted steamer astern of us. The hull was also plainly to be seen. The vessel appeared to be in ballast. Our ship's officer said she was 12 miles away, and I think the distance was not less. For 2 whole days she was visible to us astern, sometimes the hull being quite plain, and at other times being invisible altogether, thus proving that the state of the atmosphere has more to do with the matter than globularity, if it existed, could have. According to the globe theory, an object plainly visible to the naked eye and seen by scores of people should have been 96 feet below the horizon, allowing both vessels to be the same height above water, which was as near as possible correct, as our ship had scarcely any cargo on board and presented a high side out of the water. Another witness, to the editor of the Earth Review, quote, "Sir, in August last, I, with several other friends, being in Oban for a holiday, took a trip for a day in a small yacht on Loch Lorne, and being a glorious sunshiny day, and so calm that not a ripple was seen, and being becalmed for an hour about midday, we observed a good many sights of various kinds. Amongst other things that we saw was a yacht, which the captain told us was 12 miles distant. We saw all the masts and part of the hull, and to get a better view of her, we took our binocular opera glass, a good one. Now, sir, wouldn't it require a funny curvature table either with or without the odd fractions to explain how we saw the hull of that vessel 12 miles off? According to a table furnished by the present astronomer Royal recently, it ought to have been 66 feet below the line of sight, but the table that we saw it from was the side of our yacht, and we concluded that the sea was level. Yours respectfully, Sedal, Halifax, John Smith. The following is from 100 Proofs that the Earth is not a Globe. Quote, if we take a trip down the Chesapeake Bay in the daytime, we may see for ourselves the utter fallacy of the idea that when a vessel appears hull down, as it's called, it is because the hull is behind the water, for vessels have been seen, and may often be seen again, presenting the appearance spoken of, and away, far away beyond those vessels, and at the same moment the level shoreline, with its accompanying complement of tall trees, towering up in perspective over the heads of hull-down ships. The following is from Chambers' Journal on February 1895, page 32. Quote, a good many years ago, a pilot in the Mauritius reported that he had seen a vessel which turned out to be 200 miles off. This incident caused a good deal of discussion in nautical circles at the time, and, strange to say, a seemingly well authenticated case of the same kind occurred afterwards at Aden. A pilot there announced that he had seen from the heights of the Bombay steamer, then nearly due. He stated precisely the direction in which he saw her, and added that her head was not then turned towards the port. 2 days afterwards, the missing steamer entered the port, and it was found on enquiries that at the time mentioned by the pilot she was exactly in the direction and position indicated by him, about 200 miles away. End quote. Under exceptional conditions of the atmosphere, therefore, enormous distances can be penetrated by the unaided eye, and with a good telescope, objects at distances totally out of proportion to the globular theory can be seen. Take the case of the above steamer. If the globe theory were correct, this vessel would have been 4 miles below the line of sight, allowing 1 mile of height for the observer, and thus, even when aided by the most powerful telescope ever invented, could not have been seen. Once more, it dawns on the thinking man that the world is not the globe of popular credulity, but an extended and motionless plain. Distances. If the world be a globe, the distances which are sailed by ships sailing around the globe would answer to the theory, and measurements as made by such ships would always answer to the theoretical distances of the astronomer. That such is not the case, as I shall presently show, disproves the theory. First, let us inquire how distances are obtained, say in sailing on an easterly or westerly course. In obtaining the longitude by dead reckoning, an allowance for supposed convergence or shorter longitude according to the latitude would have to be made, when the result obtained should not vary much from longitude obtained by observation. When currents have to be reckoned with, the allowance for their known velocity in any direction would bring the result of the dead reckoning up to that obtained by observation, always remembering that if a ship is steering east, for example, the allowance for the direction of the current cannot be the same as would have to be made by a vessel in the same latitudes steering west. If the allowance for currents be made in the same direction when the ship is steering west as when he's steering east, it is very evident that this is done to bring the theoretical result into line with the actual facts. Navigators are often at a loss to account for the great differences between dead reckoning, even when the allowance for currents has been made, and the ship's position as obtained by observation. Believing that they are sailing on a globular surface, nothing presents itself to the mind but the usual theories by which they unsuccessfully endeavor to account for the discrepancy. Did they know that the surface of the ocean is a planar surface? They ought to know this. Something new would present itself for consideration, theories would be abandoned, and investigation instituted. The result could not fail to be advantageous to navigation in general. In South Sea Voyages by Sir James Ross, Volume 1, page 96, states, quote, "We found ourselves every day from 12 to 18 miles by observation in advance of our reckoning." Page 27, "By our observations at noon, we found ourselves 58 miles to the eastward of our reckoning in 2 days." Voyage Towards the South Pole by Captain Joss Weddell states, quote, "February 11th at noon in latitude 65 degrees south, our chronometers gave 44 miles more westing than the log in 3 days." Lieutenant Wilkes says that in less than 18 hours, he was 20 miles to the east of his reckoning in latitude 54 degrees 20 minutes south. In Anson's Voyage Round the World by R. Walter, page 76, the following statement is made, quote, "It was indeed the most wonderful event that the currents should have driven us to the eastward with such strength, for the whole squadron esteemed themselves upwards of 10 degrees more westerly than this land, Straits of Magellan, so that in running down, by our account, about 19 degrees of longitude, we had not really advanced even half that distance." End quote. Captain Woodside of the American Barkentine Echo at Cape Town on 26 June 1898 reports that on the 12th of January 1896, being without observation for 2 days and going 250 miles a day on a straight course, he expected to be 100 miles south and a long way to the eastward of Gough Island in latitude 40 degrees south, but was startled to find his ship making straight for the island and barely escaping shipwreck. The Felina Winslow was wrecked there 25 years ago, and there are remains of numerous other wrecks. The fact that in sailing either east or west the currents are allowed the same way proves that the rotundity idea is the factor which effectually debars our navigators from obtaining a correct solution of the difficulty. Let it be acknowledged that as the surface of all standing water is level, the world is a plane and not a globe, and investigation may be instituted into the causes of the discrepancies to which we have alluded. But so long as the globular idea prevails, so long will it be impossible for the navigator to arrive at the truth of the matter. I have further weight of evidence on this important branch of our subject by comparing the theoretical measurements to the supposed globe with the distances actually made in sailing. These data, which I now submit, prove clearly to any unprejudiced mind that the world cannot be a globe of astronomical imagination, but that it is an outstretched circular plane without axial or orbital motion. Sir Robert Ball, in his Story of the Heavens, page 163, informs the reader that, quote, "The dimensions of the earth are known with a high degree of accuracy." End quote. This writer is recognized as an able exponent of globular hypothesis, and it is generally conceded that what he says may be regarded as correct. Let us now inquire with what high degree of accuracy the dimensions of the earth are known. If the earth be the globe it is generally said to be, it is evident that the further we go south from the equator, the smaller will the circles be, and no circle south of the equator could be equal to that at the equator. The S.S. Nithsdale of Glasgow, Captain Haddon, sailed from Hamelin Bay in Western Australia on 8th January 1898, arriving at Port Natal on 1st February 1898. Having steamed 4,519 nautical miles. Her log, of which the chief officer, Mr. Boyle, also a past master, kindly gave me a copy, shows that she did not make quite a rhomb line track. Hamelin Bay is in latitude 34 degrees south and longitude 115 east. Port Natal is situated in latitude 29.5 south and 31.4 east longitude. The difference of the latitude being so small, we shall not get far out if we take the middle latitude, 32 degrees south. The difference of longitude is 84 degrees, or 4.28 of the complete circle of 360 degrees around the world. Something must be added to the ship's log so as to bring the distance up to the rhomb line track, say 100 miles. Therefore, to find the distance around the world at 32 degrees south, it is only necessary to solve the following problem. As 84 degrees is to 360 degrees, 4,619 nautical or 5,390 statute miles is to x. Answer equals 23,000 miles, nearly. This is several thousand miles in excess of what the distance would or could be on the globe, and further south on a globe the distances would be even less. In the cruise of HMS Challenger by W.J.J. Spry, the distance made good from the Cape of Good Hope to Melbourne is stated to be 7,637 miles. The Cape is in latitude 34 degrees 21 minutes south, and Melbourne in latitude 37 degrees south, the longitude of the Cape being 18 degrees 30 minutes east, and Melbourne 145 degrees east. The middle latitude is 35 and a half. Difference of longitude is 126 and a half, which makes the distance round the world at that latitude 35 and a half degrees to be over 25,000 statute miles and as great as the equator is said to be. Thus, we see on reliable evidence that the further we go south, the greater is the distance round the world, not the smaller as demanded by the globe. This latter distance is many thousand miles more than the purely theoretical measurement of the world at that latitude south. From the same work, we find the distance from Sydney to Wellington to be 1,432 miles. The middle latitude is 37 and a half degrees, and the difference of longitude is 23 degrees 36 minutes, which gives the distance round the world at latitude 37 and a half degrees south, 25,500 statute miles. This distance is again greater than the distance around the globe is said to be many thousands of miles greater than could be the case on the globe this far south. Thus, on purely practical data, apart from any theory, the world is proved to diverge as the south is approached and not to converge as it would do on a globe. Fluids. It is in the nature of fluids to be and remain level, and when that level is disturbed by any influence whatsoever, motion ensues until equilibrium is resumed. Professor Airy tells us in his 6 lectures on astronomy that, quote, "Quicksilver is perfectly fluid, its surface is perfectly horizontal." End quote. We may add that all fluids are the same for the reason given by the next writer. Mr. W. T. Lynn of the Royal Observatory, Greenwich, in his First Principles of Natural Philosophy says, quote, "The upper surface of a fluid at rest is a horizontal plane, because if a part of the surface were higher than the rest, those parts of the fluid which are under it would exert a greater pressure upon the surrounding parts than they receive from them, so that the motion would take place amongst the particles and continue until there were none at a higher level than the rest, that is, until the upper surface of the whole mass of fluid becomes a horizontal plane." End quote. The English Mechanic of 26 June 1896 says, quote, "Since any given body of water must have a level surface, i.e., no one part higher than the other, and seeing that all of our oceans, a few inland seas excepted, are connected together, it follows that they are all virtually of the same level." End quote. In March 1870, the Bedford Canal was chosen to experiment upon with a view of determining whether water was horizontal or convex. The following argument is taken from the report as printed in the Field for 26 March 1870 and is considered to be sufficient and unanswerable. Quote, "The stations appeared, to all intents and purposes, equidistant in the field of view, and also in a regular series, first, a distant bridge, secondly, the central signal, and thirdly, the horizontal crosshair marking the point of observation, showing that the central disk, 13 foot 4 high, does not depart from a straight line taken from end to end of the 6 miles in any way whatsoever, either laterally or vertically. For if so, and as in the case of the disk 9 feet 4 inches high, if it were lower or nearer the water, it would appear, as that disk does, nearer to the distant bridge, If it were higher, it would appear in the opposite direction, nearer the horizontal crosshair which marks the point of observation. As the disk 4 foot lower appears near to the distant bridge, so a disk to be really 5 foot higher would have to appear, still nearer to the horizontal crosshair of the telescope. And therefore it is shown that a straight line from one point to the other passes through the central point in its course, and that a curved surface of water has not been demonstrated." End quote. In Theoretical Astronomy, page 47, it is stated, quote, "On the Royal Observatory wall at Greenwich, in a brass plate, which states that a certain horizontal mark is 154 foot above mean water at Greenwich, and 155.7 foot above mean water at Liverpool." End quote. The difference of the level between Liverpool and Greenwich is thus shown to be only 1.7 feet. If the world were a globe, the difference of the level would be many thousands of feet. It is a common saying that water will find its level, and this is true. If water be dammed back, it will, as soon as released, take the easiest course to where it can find its level yet again. The following from the Natural Mercury of 24 October 1898 fully illustrates this point. A mountain of water. Quote, "London, October 19th, Digger's News Special. The steamer Blanche Rock, whilst entering the Morpeth dock, Birkenhead, burst the dock gates. The water inside, which was 8 feet higher than the level of the river, rushed out with tremendous force. The swirling mass of water damaged the shipping and beached and sank a number of barges. 2 lives were lost." End quote. As soon as the water got to the level of the river, its power would cease. Charles Darwin, in his Voyage of a Naturalist, page 328, tells us, quote, "I was reminded of the pampas of Buenos Aires, seeing the disk of the rising sun intersected by an horizon level as that of the ocean." End quote. A globe with level oceans would be a new thing in geography indeed. Figure of the Earth. In the History of Conflict Between Religion and Science by J. W. Draper, page 153, we are informed that, quote, "An uncritical observation of the aspect of nature persuades us that the earth is an extended level surface which sustains the dome of the sky, a firmament dividing the waters above from the waters beneath, that the heavenly bodies, the sun, the moon, and stars, pursue their way, moving from east to west, their insignificant size and motion round the motionless earth proclaiming their inferiority. Of the various organic forms surrounding man, none rival him in dignity, and hence he seems justified in concluding that everything has been created for his use, the sun for the purpose of giving him light by day, and the moon and stars by night." End quote. A critical observation of nature, I may say, persuades an intelligent and unbiased mind that seeing is believing, and that, therefore, the world is not the globe of modern ideas. Dr. Draper further tells us on page 156 of his book, quote, "Many ages previously, speculation had been brought from India to Europe by Pythagoras. It presented the sun as the center of the system. Around him the planets revolved in circular orbits, their order of position being Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, each of them being supposed to rotate on its axis as it revolved around the sun. Aristarchus adopted the Pythagorean system as representing the actual facts. This was the result of a recognition of the sun's amazing distance and therefore of his enormous size. The heliocentric system, thus regarding the sun as the central orb, degraded the earth to a very subordinate rank, making her only one of a company of 6 revolving bodies." End quote. This speculation, apt word this, has been shown in the foregoing pages to be without the slightest foundation in fact, and the world shown to be a plane and not a globe. In Modern Science and Modern Thought by S. Lang, the following imaginative proof of the globular figure of the earth is brought forward. Quote, Well, if, for instance, by traveling 65 miles from north to south, we lower the apparent height of the pole star 1 degree, it is mathematically certain that we have traveled this 65 miles not along a flat surface, but along a circle, which is 360 times 65, or, in round numbers, 24,000 miles in circumference and 8,000 miles in diameter, and that the form of the Earth is a perfect sphere of these dimensions. End quote. And on pages 162 and 163, the following is the continuation of the same ridiculous argument. Quote, until the Cape was doubled, the course of da Gama's ships was in a general manner southward. Very soon it was noticed that the elevation of the pole star above the horizon was diminishing, and soon after the equator was reached the star had ceased to be visible. Meantime, other stars, some of them forming magnificent constellations, had come into view, the stars of the southern hemisphere. All this was in conformity to the theoretical expectation founded on the admission of the globular form of the Earth. End quote. If we select a flat street, say a mile long, containing a row of lamps, it would be noticed that from where we stand, the lamps gradually decline to the ground, the last one being apparently quite on the ground. Take the lamp at the end of the street and walk away from it 100 yards, and it will appear to be much nearer the ground than when we were close to it. Keep on walking away from it, and it will appear to be gradually depressed until it is last seen on the ground and then disappears. Now, according to the astronomers, the whole mile was only depressed about 8 inches from one end to the other, so that this 8 inches could not account for the enormous depression of the light as we recede from it. This proves that the depression of the pole star can and does take place in relation to a flat surface simply because we increase our distance from it, the same as from the street lamp. In other words, the further away we get from any object above us, as a star for example, the more it is depressed, and if we go far enough, it will sink or appear to sink to the horizon and then disappear. The writer has tried the street lamp many times with the same result. Growth of the Earth. R. A. Proctor, in his work Our Place Among Infinities, pages 9 and 10, tells us that the Earth was once a mass of glowing vapor. Quote, capturing then as now, but far more actively than now, masses of matter which approach near enough and growing by these continual indrafts from without. All that is within and upon the earth are formed of materials which have been drawn in from these depths of space surrounding us on all sides, particles drawn in towards the earth by processing continuing millions and millions of ages. End quote. This is written with as much authority as the writer could have had he been present when the supposed spark was shot off from the sun. He writes as though he had carefully watched the spark grow bigger, age by age, until it assumed the proportions it had when it began to cool down. He tells his story as though he had been an eyewitness of all the supposed processes during all the supposed countless ages until protoplasm made its appearance and life began to evolve upon the supposed globe. The reader is made to understand, from the scientific manner in which the mythical storyteller unfolds his mythical tale, that he, the retailer of the story, carefully watched the evolution of the earth until the time came when the astronomers were able to tell us, without the fear of contradiction, that the earth actually had taken all these millions of ages to evolve into its present form and size. Marvelous, is it not, and how very scientific, to be sure. The reader may pass over the whole of the foregoing extract from the pen of the greatest astronomer of the age, for there is not one word of it truth. It is the product of a fertile imagination, and nothing more. The world is much the same as it was in the days of our grandfathers, only the people now are more infidel than they were in those days, and since its creation it is not greatly altered, except as it has been altered by the universal flood in the time of that righteous man Noah. The flood disturbed the strata of the earth and broke up its layers, hence we find the bones of men and animals beneath the crust, which fact causes infidel scientists who are seeking a proof of the untruth of the Bible to believe that the earth is many millions of ages old, and therefore not the earth of the creation as recorded in Genesis. The poet Cowper has well said, quote, "Hear the just law, the judgment of the skies. He that hates truth shall be the dupe of the lies. And he that will be cheated to the last, delusions, strong as hell, shall bind him fast." Gravitation. The law of gravitation is said by the advocates of the Newtonian system of astronomy to be the greatest discovery of science and the foundation of the whole of modern astronomy. If, therefore, it can be shown that gravitation is a pure assumption and an imagination of the mind only, that it has no existence outside the brains of its expounders and advocates, the whole of the hypothesis of this modern so-called science fall to the ground as flat as the surface of the ocean, and this most exact of all sciences, this wonderful feat of the intellect, becomes at once the most ridiculous superstition and the most gigantic imposture to which ignorance and credulity could ever be exposed. In the Story of the Heavens by Sir R. Ball, it is stated on page 82, quote, "The law of gravitation, the greatest discovery that science has yet witnessed, the law of gravitation which underlies the whole of astronomy," page 101, "the law of gravitation announces that every body in the universe attracts every other body with a force which varies inversely with the square of the distance." Popular Science Recreations by G. Tissandier, pages 486 and 7, contains the following: "Gravitation is the force which keeps the planets in their orbits. Every object in the world tends to attract every other object in proportion to the quantity of matter in which each consists." End quote. Professor W. B. Carpenter, in his work Nature and Man, page 365, says, quote, "The laws of light and gravitation," wrote Mr. Atkinson to Harriet Martineau 30 years ago, "extend over the universe and explain whole classes of phenomena. And this explanation, according to the same writer, is all sufficient, philosophy finding no God in nature, nor seeing the want of any God." End quote. C. Vernon Boyes, F.R.S. A.R.S.M.M.R.L., in his paper The Newtonian Constant of Gravitation, says, "G represents that mighty principle under the influence of which every star, planet, and satellite in the universe pursues its allotted course. Unlike any other known physical influence, it is independent of medium. It knows no refraction. It cannot cast a shadow. It is a mysterious power which no man can explain. Of its propagation through space, all men are ignorant. I cannot contemplate this mystery, at which we ignorantly wonder, without thinking of the altar on Mars's hill. When will a St. Paul arise able to declare it unto us? Or is gravitation like life, a mystery that can never be solved?" End quote. Proceedings of the Royal Institution of Great Britain, March 1895, page 355. Professor W. B. Carpenter, in his paper Nature and Law, published in the Modern Review for October 1890, says, quote, "The first of the great achievements of Newton in relation to our present subject was a piece of purely geometrical reasoning. Assuming two forces to act upon a body, of which one should be capable of imparting to it uniform motion in a straight line, whilst the other should attract it towards a fixed point in accordance with Galileo's law of gravity, he demonstrated that the path of the body would be deflected into a curve. The idea of continuous onward motion in a straight line as the result of an original impulsive force not antagonized or affected by any other, formularized by Newton as his first law of motion, is not borne out by any acquired experience, and does not seem likely to ever be thus verified. For in no experiment we have it in our power to make can we entirely eliminate the antagonizing effects of friction and atmospheric resistance, and thus all movement that is subject to this retardation, and is not sustained by any fresh action of the impelling force, must come to an end. Hence the conviction commonly entertained that Newton's first law of motion be true cannot be philosophically admitted to be anything more than just a probability. We have no proof, and in the nature of things can never get one, of the assumption of the attractive force exerted by the earth, or by any of the bodies in the solar system, upon other bodies at a distance. Newton himself strongly felt that the impossibility of rationality accounting for action at a distance through an intervening vacuum was the weak point of his system. All that we can be said to know is that which we learn from our own experience. Now, in regard to the sun's attraction for the earth and planets, we have no certain experience at all. Unless we could be transported to his surface, we have no means of experimentally comparing solar gravity with terrestrial gravity, and if we could ascertain this, we should be no nearer to the determination of his attraction for bodies at a distance. The doctrine of universal gravitation, then, is a pure assumption." End quote. In Letters to the British Association, Professor Bernstein says, quote, "The theory that motions are produced through material attraction is absurd. Attributing such a power to a mere matter which is passive by nature is a supreme illusion. It is a lovely and easy theory to satisfy any man's mind, but when the practical test comes, it falls all to pieces and becomes one of the most ridiculous theories to common sense and judgment." End quote. The following extracts are taken from A Million of Facts by Sir Richard Phillips. "If the sun has any power, it must be derived from motion, and if acting on bodies at a distance, like Jupiter on his moons, or the earth on its moon, there must be an intervening medium to conduct its momentum through its system. It is a principle never to be lost sight of that circular motion is a necessary result of equal action and reaction in contrary directions, for the harmony would be disturbed by variation of distance, if the motion were rectilinear. The same action and reaction are therefore only to be preserved by reciprocal circular motion. No attraction and no projectile force are therefore necessary. Their invention must be regarded as blunders of a superstitious age. If the bodies came near while moving the same way, there would be no mutual reaction, and they would go together for want of reaction, and not owing to that mechanical impossibility called attraction. To accommodate the hypothetical law of universal gravitation to the phenomenon of the planets, astronomers have preferred to change the mean density of matter itself, and the Earth, for comparison, being taken at a density of 1,000, to accommodate Mercury, the assumed law, it is taken as 2,585, Venus 1,024, Mars 656, Jupiter 201, Saturn 103, and Herschel 218. Consequently, we have the paradox that Jupiter, 1,290 times larger than the Earth, they claim, contains but 323 times more atoms. Saturn, 1,107 times larger but 114 times more atoms. Even the Sun, according to these theorists, is but one-fourth the density of the Earth. There may be differences, but chemistry and all the laws that unite and compound atoms are utterly at variance with so rash and wild a hypothesis. It is a waste of time to break a butterfly on a wheel, but as astronomy and all science is beset with fancies about attraction and repulsion, it is necessary to eradicate them. If there are two bodies and it is required to move A to C, the force moving A to C must proceed from the side A. Either some impact or some involvement of a motion towards C must act at A to carry A to C. The modern schools, however, assert that B may move A to C and A move B to C, and this is mutual attraction. Hence it is necessary to believe that B acts on the side A where B is not present, and that A acts on B on the side B where A is not present. In other words, A is required to be where it is not, and also be in force at A, so as to move B to C, all of which is absurd. If, in any case, A and B approach, it is not because A moves towards B itself, or B moves A towards itself, but owing to some causes which affect the space in which A and B are situated, and which causes act on A at A and on B at B. The statement that A moves B and B moves A is ignorance, and is what is meant by attraction. It is also worse than ignorance to justify idleness by asserting that the true cause is indifferent, or to justify ignorance by asserting that it is unknowable. This reasoning applies to every species of attraction, whatever may be the pomposity of equivocal terms in which it is described. Universally, bodies cannot push other bodies towards themselves. If A and B are said to repel one another, and that B makes A move to C, and A makes B move to D, we have to bear in mind that while A is moving to C, it is in force only in that direction and cannot therefore be moving B towards D. In like manner, while B is moving to D, it is in force only in that direction and cannot therefore be in force in the contrary direction so as to move A to C. Every species and variety of attraction and repulsion are therefore absurd. Matter is in all cases the conductor of motion. If a body moves, it is because it is the patient of some sufficient momentum of body or matter acting on the side from which the body moves, and only in force in that direction. Some adopters of attraction, etc., talk by false analogy of drawing, others of pulling, lifting, etc. Laplace invents gravitating atoms and gives them a velocity of 6,000 times that of light, which in some way, known only to himself, performs the work of bringing the body in. Others imagine little hooks. As to drawing, pulling, etc., it behooves them to show the tackle, the levers, and the ropes, etc. In spite of all the learning, ingenuity, and elaborations of men confessedly very able, if there is not and cannot be any action of the nature of attraction, and if the phenomena ascribed to it are local effects of palpable local causes, and if all the phenomenon and involvement may be clearly explained on different principles, then it may be to be lamented that so much ability and character should have been wasted, while a respect for truth and sound reasoning demands that the whole should be forgotten as a dream, or demolished as a card-house." Professor Airy, in his Lectures on Astronomy, 5th edition, page 194, informs us, quote, "Newton was the first person who made a calculation of the figure of the earth on the theory of gravitation. He took the following supposition as the only one to which his theory could be applied. He assumed the earth to be a fluid. This fluid matter he assumed to be equally dense in every part. For trial of his theory be supposed to be assumed fluid earth to be a spheroid. In this manner he inferred that the form of the earth would be a spheroid, in which the length of the shorter is to the longer, or equatorial diameter, in the proportion of 229 to 230. The New Principia by N. Crossland contains the following, quote, "In ascending a hill we experience a hard struggle and feel more fatigued than when walking on level ground. Why is this? The Newtonian attributes this to the attraction of gravitation of the earth, against the pull of which we have to contend. But if he would be consistent with his theory, that the attraction of gravitation diminishes inversely as the square of the distance from the center of the earth, we ought, in defiance of experience, to feel it to be less laborious to ascend a hill than to promenade the same distance on level ground, because as we ascend we recede from the center of the earth. Therefore the force of gravity ought to diminish in a corresponding degree. The Newtonian can only get over this difficulty by a species of scientific quibbling. According to the definition of weight I have given, the solution of the problem is perfectly simple. In ascending a hill a man comes in conflict with the law that the natural tendency of any body is to seek the easiest and shortest route to its level of stability. He chooses the very reverse, and must therefore endure the consequences of acting in opposition to this law. At every step he has to lift his own weight, and the higher he mounts, the more he feels the influence of the law which he defies. His easiest and more direct course to obey the law of weight is to remain where he is. The next is to descend to a lower level. The attraction of gravitation is said to be stronger at the surface of the earth than at a distance from it. Is it so? If I spring upwards perpendicularly, I cannot, with all my might, ascend more than 4 feet from the ground. But if I jump in a curve with a low trajectory, keeping my highest elevation about 3 feet, I might clear a bound space above the earth of about 18 feet, so that I can overcome the so-called force or the pull at the distance of 4 feet in the proportion of 18 to 4, being the very reverse of what I ought to be able to do according to the Newtonian hypothesis. Again, take the case of a shot propelled from a cannon. By the force of the explosion and the influence of the reputed action of gravitation, the shot forms a parabolic curve, and finally falls to the earth. Here we may ask why. If the forces are the same, direct impulse and gravitation, does not the shot from an orbit like that of a planet and revolve round the earth? The Newtonian may reply, because the impulse which propelled the shot is temporary, and the impulse which propelled the planet is permanent. Precisely so. But why is the impulse permanent in the case of the planet revolving around the sun? What is the cause of this permanence? We are asked by the Newtonians to believe that the action of gravitation, which we can easily overcome by the slightest exercise of violating and raising a hand or a foot, is so overwhelmingly violent when we lose our balance and fall a distance of a few feet, that this force, which is imperceptible under usual conditions, may, under extraordinary circumstances, cause the fracture of every limb we possess. Common sense must reject this interpretation. Gravitation does not furnish a satisfactory explanation of the phenomena here described, whereas the definition of weight already given does, for a body seeking in the readiest manner its level of stability would produce precisely the results experienced. If the influence which kept us securely attached to this earth were identical with that which is powerful enough to disturb a distant planet in its orbit, we should be more immediately conscious of its masterful presence and potency, whereas this influence is so impotent in the very spot where it is supposed to be most dominant that we find an insurmountable difficulty in accepting the idea of its existence. Fortunately for our faculty of locomotion, the Newtonian hypothesis may be rejected as a snare and a delusion. It is quite amusing to watch Newtonians and Darwinians floundering about in their attempts to expound the mysteries of creation. Their theories are as ridiculous as the fashion which once prevailed for Della Cruscan poetry, and they ought to be entreated with equal severity. It seems quite possible that during the last 200 years we have been living a sort of scientific fool's paradise, and that universal gravitation is a gigantic Newtonian mare's nest. As a theoretical scientific guide, we must give up Sir Isaac Newton as a useless and misleading, and allow his reputation to retire into private life. In Knowledge of the 17th and 24th February 1882, there appeared a discourse in the Birth of the Moon by Tidal Evolution by Dr. Ball, the Astronomer Royal with cheese for Ireland, which I should say is without exception the most delusive and absurd contribution ever made to so-called science. At one time I thought that Parallax, who told us that the earth was a flat plane like a plate, was the most misguided man in the kingdom, but I now believe that he is quite entitled to take rank in scientific wisdom, and to sit down on an equality with the Astronomer Royal with cheese." End quote. I have quoted at length on this important matter, and the evidence here produced, besides very much more in the same direction, for which I have not the space here, shows clearly that there is no such thing as the force of gravity in existence anywhere. One of the world's so-called great thinkers, J.S. Mill, is quoted in Professor Carpenter's Nature and Man, page 385, as saying, "Although we speak of a man's fall as caused by the slipping of his foot, or the breaking of a rung, as the cause may be, the efficient cause is the attractive force of the earth, which the loss of support to the man's foot brings into operation." End quote. If a man is not deeper than to believe what this deep thinker has left on record in this matter, if he has no more brain power than to accept the foregoing statement, I would strongly advise him to cease thinking altogether, and thus save the few brains he has. It is simply astounding that men who in business matters are sharp enough are as dull as bricks and as credulous as children when the awe-inspiring subject of gravitation, that grand masterpiece of astronomy, is the theme. To ask the reason why, or to venture to suggest that the assumptions of the learned require some sort of proof to back them up, never seems to strike moderns who believe in this monstrous humbug. A. Gibbon, in Sun, Moon, and Stars, page 27, says, quote, "If the sun is pulling with such power at the earth and all her sister planets, why do they not fall down upon him?" End quote. A very proper question, truly. And when this question is propounded to astronomers, they cannot give an answer worth recording. They simply do not know how to answer the question without stultifying their common sense. But the above writer thinks it can be answered, so he says, quote, "Did you ever tie a ball to a string and swing it rapidly round and round your head? If you did, you must have noticed that the steady outward pull of the ball." End quote. The steady outward pull of the ball clearly implies that the ball has intelligence and knows just what to do so as to prevent its hitting the head of the operator. The outward pull of a ball which is fastened to the hand of the operator by a string is clearly impossible. If the operator ceased to impel it round and round his head by the mechanical attachment and the power he exerts in swinging it round, the ball would seek its level of stability and fall to the ground. And this illustration is used to teach what gravitation is and how it acts. We shall just follow the illustration to its logical issue and see where the theory is. The illustration implies that between all the bodies in the universe there is a connecting link which keeps the body that attracts attached to the body that is attracted. This connecting link, in the case of the ball, is the string. Now, we could readily understand gravitation if this illustration conveyed to us by the ball and the string were a correct representation of fact. But we very naturally asked, what is the connecting link? Of what does it consist? And of what do all the connecting links between the sun and the myriad of orbs in heaven consist? Would not the strings get somewhat entangled? Has this connecting link ever been observed anywhere? The answer to these pertinent questions is, there is no connecting link in existence. When the missing link is produced, we are prepared to admit all the gravitation theorists teach on the subject. Until then, we shall continue to regard it as the myth that it undoubtedly is. And I'll just put a little note in here, and that is, even after the era of Einstein, the questions that he's posing here are no more answered today in the 21st century than they were back in the late 1800s. Anyway, but we are not done with this illustration just yet. The ball and string device sets forth that the body that attracts is not only connected with the body attracted, but that the former is the motive power of the latter, that the sun is the power which compels the earth to revolve around it, even as the motive power of the ball is the exertion of the hand of the operator. Without the connecting link, the earth would fall, according to the astronomers, in a rectilinear path forever. But what these wise men do not see, and which is necessarily a part of the theory, as represented by the ball and the string idea, is that the motive power also must come from the sun. Without this motive power and the connecting link, the whole of the theory falls to pieces. There is no motive power in the sun to cause the earth to revolve around it, and there is no connecting link between the sun and the earth to keep the latter in its position. Consequently, the theory of universal gravitation has no existence in fact. He who cannot reason is a fool, he who will not reason is a bigot, and he who dares not reason is a coward, but he who can and dares to reason is a man. If the reader can and dares to reason, let him reason this matter out, and discover whether astronomy has drummed into children's heads at school, and vauntingly displayed with many pictures from public platforms, has 1 inch of standing ground, or one reason to offer as an apology for its further existence and power to befool mankind longer. These are strong statements, but not stronger than the facts warrant. The Story of the Heavens by Sir Robert Ball is not only an authoritative treatise, which it is, coming from such a recognized exponent on this science, but a fulsome account of general principles and details in popular form. As a literary production, it possesses considerable merit, and its good English entitles it to the respect and consideration of all its readers. But as a contribution to science, it is the most absurd and unreasoning conglomeration of nonsensical and impossible ideas this writer has ever heard. On page 110 of this book we read that Kepler found that the movements of the planets could be explained by supposing that the path in which each one revolved was an ellipse. This, in itself, was a discovery of the most commanding importance." End quote. To explain anything by supposition, and then to label the supposition a discovery, is ridiculous in the domain of science, and a marvel of literary ingenuity. On the same page, the first law of planetary motion is enunciated in these words, quote, "Each planet revolves around the sun in an elliptical path, having the sun as one of the foci." And on page 112, the ellipse is shown with the sun in one focus. Throughout the book, however, the other focus is not mentioned, and it is very evident from the diagram that if the sun were of sufficient power to retain the earth in its orbit when nearest the sun, when the earth arrived at the part of its elliptical path furthest from the sun, the attractive force, unless very greatly increased, would be utterly incapable of preventing the earth rushing away into space in a right line forever, as astronomers say. On the other hand, it is equally clear that if the sun's attraction were just sufficient to keep the earth in its proper path when furthest from the sun, and thus to prevent it from rushing off into space, the same power of attraction when the earth was nearest to the sun would be so much greater that unless the attraction were greatly diminished, nothing would prevent the earth rushing towards and being absorbed by the sun, there being no counterbalancing focus to prevent such a catastrophe. As astronomy makes no reference to the increase and diminution of the attractive force of the sun, called gravitation, for the above necessary purposes, we are again forced to the conclusion that the great discovery of which astronomers are so proud is absolutely non-existent. The law of dynamics assisted by geometry makes it, as the learned say, mathematically certain that no such force as gravitation exists anywhere in the universe. As another has well said, its invention must be regarded as a blunder of superstitious ages. If the earth were the globe of astronomical invention, and if gravitation were needed to keep it in its path around the sun, it is easily seen that gravitation must be circular, as then and only then would the attraction be equal in every part of the path, and so cause the earth to describe an exact circle throughout the year. Astronomers say that the earth moves and not the sun, and that this movement of the earth causes the seasons, and further that the movement of the sun, which we see is really caused by the movement of the earth. If therefore the sun appears to make an exactly circular path every day of the year, there might be some ground for the astronomer's supposition of gravitation. That the sun's path is an exact circle for only about 4 periods in a year, and then of only a few hours, at the equinoxes and at the solstices, completely disproves the, quote, "might have been" of circular gravitation, and by consequence of all gravitation. It has long been pointed out that gravitation, if it existed at all, must be circular, as the following from Draper's Conflict Between Religion and Science, page 168 shows. Quote, "Astronomers justly affirm that the book of Copernicus, De Revolutionibus, changed the face of their science. It incontestably established the heliocentric theory. It showed that the distance of the fixed stars is infinitely great, and that their earth is a mere point in the heavens. Anticipating Newton, Copernicus imputed gravity for the sun, the moon, and heavenly bodies, but he was led astray by assuming that the celestial motions must be circular. Observations on this orbit of Mars and his different diameters at different times has led Copernicus to this theory." End quote. That the paths of the orbs of heaven are not exactly circular disproves the theory of gravitation entirely. It is impossible to make a ball tied to the hand with a string revolve in an elliptical path, circular motion only being possible. So we may consign the illustration, together with the thing it is intended to illustrate, into oblivion. The volume already quoted, Sun, Moon, and Stars, states on page 73 that, quote, "Comets obey the attraction of the sun, yet he appears to have a singular power of driving the comets' tails away from himself. For however rapidly the comet may be rushing round the sun, and however long the tail may be, it is almost always found to stream in an opposite direction from the sun." End quote. Here we have an acknowledged failure of the law of gravitation, which is said to be universal. Now comes a declaration which supports my contention that gravitation is non-existent. In Science and Culture by Professor T. H. Huxley, page 136, the following statement is made, quote, "If the law of gravitation ever failed to be true, even to the smallest extent, for that period the calculations of the astronomer have no application." End quote. After such an authoritative declaration, we may well dismiss the subject, and we are fairly entitled to conclude with such a consensus of evidence against the commonly received view of gravitation, together with the application of the principles of sound logic, that gravitation has not and never had any existence, and the idea of such a force must be relegated to the limbo of mythology. End of section 2, Zetetic Cosmogony. If you're enjoying this audio book, please consider becoming a channel supporter through PayPal, Patreon, Cash App, and all the rest. Links in the descripts. Thanks so much for watching. Section 3 coming up shortly. God bless you guys. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace out, everybody.